He was 7 years old the first time they moved his dinner plate outside. Not because he misbehaved, not because he broke anything, but because the new Luna walked into the dining hall, wrinkled her nose, and said, "That smell! It's offensive. Wolves with no scent don't eat at the Alpha's table." His father sat at the head of that table. He picked up his fork, and he said nothing. From that night forward, Kyle, the firstborn son of Alpha Darien, heir to the Iron Veil pack, ate outside, with the strays, in the rain, in the cold, alone. But what the palace never understood was that the boy they threw to the strays was building an empire in the dirt. And the day his scent finally came, the walls of that palace cracked. And before we begin, subscribe and like this video if you've ever been underestimated by someone who was supposed to protect you, because this story is for you. Stay until the end. You won't regret it. Now let's begin. He had a system. Wake before the palace did. Fold the mat. Don't use the main corridor. Take the servants' passage behind the east wall where the stone was uneven and the torches burned low, where no one of importance ever walked. Be seated on the back steps, with hands folded before the first kitchen fire was lit. Be invisible before anyone arrived who might have to decide what to do about him. Kyle was 7 years old, and he had already built his entire life around making things easier for people who couldn't love him. The back steps were hard and cold in a way that went beyond temperature, the kind of cold that felt personal. Like the stone itself had been told what he was, and had decided to agree. He sat with his knees tucked to his chest, and his chin resting on top of them, and he watched the dark tree line at the edge of the territory, and he breathed. Just breathed. That was enough in those early minutes. The world hadn't fully woken yet, which meant the world hadn't remembered to be cruel yet. And in that thin grace between night and morning, Kyle allowed himself to simply exist without apology. He could hear the palace behind him. Even from the steps, even through the thick stone walls, he could feel it, the warmth of it pressing outward like a heartbeat. Fireplaces that burned through the night in every major room. Thick wool rugs laid over heated floors. The smell of wood smoke and roasted cedar, and the faint floral sweetness that the new Luna ordered, piped through the halls with fresh arrangements 3 times a week, because she said a palace should smell like power, not animals. Kyle pressed his palm flat against the wall beside the kitchen door sometimes, just to feel the warmth moving through it. He never went inside to find it. Inside was for people who belonged there. And belonging, he had come to understand, was not something you were given simply because of who your father was. It was something you had to smell like. Something that lived in the glands behind your jaw and announced itself before you ever opened your mouth. This one is pack, this one is rank, this one is real. Every wolf in the Iron Veil pack wore their identity on the air around them, the way other people wore their names. You knew a warrior by his scent before you saw his face. You knew an Omega, an elder, a pup just shifted for the first time. You knew everyone, except Kyle. Because with Kyle, there was nothing to know. No scent, no signal, no declaration of existence. The healers had pressed their fingers behind his ears twice now, and looked at each other with careful eyes, and said words like underdeveloped and late blooming and monitor, words that were technically kind and functionally devastating. What they meant was simple. The Alpha's firstborn son smelled like an empty room. And in a world built entirely on scent, an empty room was not a presence, it was an absence. It was a 7-year-old boy eating alone on cold stone steps, while the palace breathed warmth at his back, and pretended not to notice him sitting there. The kitchen door opened and Mira came through it the way she always did, without announcement, without ceremony, as if kindness was simply something she did between one breath and the next. She set a bowl of porridge in his lap while it was still steaming, and then she lowered herself onto the step beside him, with a slow exhale that carried every one of her years in it. She had a blanket across her arm. She unfolded it around his shoulders without asking. He hadn't known he was shivering until he stopped. Mira said nothing for a long moment. She sat beside him the way old trees stood beside rivers. Not to redirect anything, just to be there. Her hands rested in her lap, and her eyes went to the same dark tree line his did, and they sat together in the last of the quiet, and it was the closest thing to safe that Kyle's days contained. "Little Alpha," she murmured, low, soft, just for him. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. He just pulled the blanket tighter and lifted the spoon. He didn't know then that she had been in the room when he was born, that she had held him before his own father did, that she had pressed her lips to his forehead in those first bewildered minutes and whispered, "You are wanted. You are wanted. You are wanted." Not because it was true of everyone in that room, but because she had decided it would be true of her, and she had not wavered from that decision in 7 years. He didn't know any of that yet. He just knew her hands were warm and her porridge was never bland, and she was always there before anyone else. The inner doors of the palace opened somewhere behind the kitchen, and the quality of the air changed. The staff straightened, the sounds softened, the whole building seemed to tighten the way a throat tightens before difficult words. Celine moved through the kitchen without hurrying. She never hurried. Hurrying implied there was something you might miss, and Celine had arranged her world so that nothing moved without her permission. She was pale and composed, and beautiful like the blade of something expensive. You could admire the craftsmanship and still understand what it was made for. Her eyes found Kale on the steps. She didn't stop, didn't speak. She simply looked at him the way you look at a problem you've already decided someone else will handle, let the corner of her mouth lift by the smallest fraction, and moved on. The warmth from the open kitchen door swept out briefly, rich and golden, carrying the smell of the inner palace with it. Wood smoke, cedar, belonging. Then the door swung shut behind her, and the cold came back. Kale stared at the tree line and kept eating. Beside him, Mira's hand found the back of his neck, just resting there, steady and warm. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that her hand wasn't already saying better. The sun rose slowly, reluctantly, like even it knew what kind of day was coming. Kale watched it and finished every last bite. It was Mira who made the mistake, though no one who loved Kale would ever call it that. She had been the one to set his place at the table, third seat on the left, between two empty chairs, far enough from the head that it might go unnoticed, close enough that he was undeniably present. She had done it quietly, during the hour before the dinner, when the hall was still being dressed with candles and the good linen, moving with the practiced invisibility of a woman who had served this palace for decades. She had set his plate and his cup and his folded napkin, and she had stood back and looked at it and allowed herself, just briefly, to believe it might be fine. She wanted him at the table. Just once. Just to see what it looked like. It was the worst kind of hope. The kind that cost someone else. Kale had not been told in advance. One of the younger servants, and a boy barely older than him named Tomas, who had always been quietly kind in the way that people are kind when no one is watching them, had found Kale in the East Passage and told him in a low voice that there was a place set for him tonight. A real place. Inside. Kyle had looked at him for a long moment without speaking, and something in his chest had done something complicated that he didn't have the vocabulary for yet, a lifting and a tightening at the same time, like a door opening in a room that had been sealed so long the hinges screamed. He had washed his face twice, combed his hair with his fingers until it lay flat, worn the gray tunic that Mira had mended at the collar last week, because it was the best thing he owned that fit properly. He had walked into the dining hall and sat down and put his napkin in his lap and tried very hard to look like someone who had every right to be there. For a few minutes, it almost worked. The hall filled gradually. Pack elders, senior warriors, Celine's personal attendants taking their positions around the long table. Conversation moved in currents above Kael's head, flowing around him without touching him. No one acknowledged him. No one asked him to leave. He sat very still and watched the candles and thought that maybe stillness was its own kind of permission. Then Alpha Darien entered, and behind him, Celine. She saw the place setting before she reached her chair. Kael watched her see it, the slight pause in her step, and the fraction of a second where her eyes swept the table and landed on him and sharpened in a way that had nothing to do with surprise, because Celine was never surprised, only deciding how to respond to things she'd already calculated. She took her seat with perfect composure, unfolded her napkin, reached for her wine. Then she spoke, clearly and without heat, in the tone of someone making a reasonable observation. That smell. She didn't look at Kale directly. She addressed the air just to his left, the way you address a draft from a window rather than the window itself. It's offensive. I've said before, wolves with no scent don't belong at the alpha's table. It upsets the natural order of things, as surely we all feel it. The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something has just been decided and everyone is waiting to see who will say so out loud. Every pair of eyes moved, slow and inevitable as a tide, to the head of the table, to Alpha Darien. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been built for authority. Strong jaw, steady eyes, the particular stillness of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around him. He sat at the head of his table in his own hall, in his own palace, in the territory his bloodline had held for 4 generations, and he looked at his 7-year-old son sitting 3 seats down, in a mended gray tunic, with his napkin already in his lap. He looked at him, and then he picked up his fork. That was all. That was the whole of it. And he picked up his fork and turned to the elder on his right and asked something about the northern border, and the conversation resumed, and the moment closed over itself like water over a stone, and Kael sat very still and understood what had just happened, in the place where children keep the things they can't yet say out loud. A servant appeared at his elbow, young, apologetic in the eyes even as the face stayed neutral, because that was what this palace required of the people who worked in it. Master Kael, barely a whisper. If you'll allow me. The servant reached for the plate. I have it, Kael said. His voice came out even. He didn't know how. He picked up the plate himself, and the cup, and he carried them out through the side door that led to the back corridor, and then to the steps. And he did it slowly enough that no one could say he had run, and he made sure the door was fully closed behind him before he set everything down on the stone and sat and put his face in his hands. He didn't make a sound. He had already learned that crying audibly was a luxury he couldn't afford in a palace with thin walls and long memories. He sat like that for a while. The night was dark and moonless, and the cold had real teeth in it. Then something warm pressed against his leg. He lifted his face. A dog, one of the strays that drifted along the palace's outer edge, brindled and lean with one ear that folded forward, had come up the steps without him hearing and was now simply sitting beside him, not asking for anything, not going anywhere. Just there in the dark, the way Mira sat beside him in the mornings, as saying everything without saying a word. Kale stared at it. Then he picked up his fork and slid half of everything on his plate onto the stone beside the dog. They ate together in the dark, and it was the least alone he had felt in weeks. And that fact was either the saddest or the most quietly beautiful thing about being Kyle. He was never entirely sure which. He found them by following the dog. 3 days after the dining hall, Kyle was still eating on the steps, still waking before the palace, still making himself small in all the ways he had perfected. But something had shifted underneath him, quiet and tectonic, the way ground shifts before anyone feels it. Something that had previously felt like waiting, like a child holding his breath for a thing that was still coming, had begun to feel instead like an ending. Like a door not just closed, but locked, and the key dropped somewhere he would never find it. He wasn't angry. He didn't have the luxury of anger yet. He was 7, and what he felt was more fundamental than anger. A hollow foundational understanding that the place he slept in was not the place he belonged, and that no amount of stillness or smallness or early rising was going to change that. So when the brindled dog appeared at the corner of the garden wall on the third morning and looked back at him the way dogs do when they want to be followed, Kyle set down his empty bowl and followed. The garden wall ran the length of the palace's eastern face before curving south toward the outer boundary of pack territory. Kyle had never gone past the garden. There had never been a reason to. His world was the palace steps, the servants' passage, the narrow strip of courtyard where he sometimes sat in the afternoon if the weather was mild. He was not forbidden from going further exactly. But there was a way the palace made its rules known without stating them, through the careful positioning of people, through the way eyes tracked certain movements and not others, through the accumulated weight of 100 small signals that told a child with any sense where his edges were. Kyle followed the dog past his edges. Beyond the garden wall, the land sloped gently downward, through a stand of silver birch trees, whose bark caught what little morning light filtered through the clouds, and held it, pale and diffuse, like the trees were lit from the inside. The ground was soft here, last night's frost not yet burned off, and Kyle's footprints pressed dark into the grass behind him. The dog moved ahead with the unhurried confidence of something that had made this journey many times. He smelled the fire before he saw it, not wood smoke exactly, something earthier, damper, wood that wasn't entirely dry burning slowly in a shallow pit ringed with stones. Then he came through the last of the birches and stopped. There were 7 of them, a cluster of makeshift shelters at the edge of where pack territory blurred into the unclaimed land beyond. Oiled canvas stretched between trees, a low frame of lashed branches with a wool blanket nailed across it. What appeared to be the salvaged door of something leaned at an angle against a birch trunk to cut the wind. Not homes, not quite, but not nothing either. Inhabited spaces, lived-in spaces, which was different. The people in them were as weathered as their shelters. 2 older men sat near the fire, with the particular stillness of people who have learned not to move more than necessary to conserve warmth. A woman with silver-streaked hair was mending something with a needle she had to hold close to her face to thread. A large, quiet man with a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw was splitting kindling with an efficiency that suggested he had done it 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more without complaint. They were omegas, Kyle would later understand, and rogues, wolves who had been pushed beyond their pack's borders for reasons that ranged from politics to poverty to simply being too inconvenient to keep. The cast-off and the forgotten, gathered at the edge of a territory that tolerated their presence the way you tolerate a stone in a shoe, not comfortable but not worth stopping to address. And then there was the girl. She was crouched on the opposite side of the fire pit from the older man, poking at the embers with a stick in the focused, purposeful way of someone who takes fire management very seriously. She was roughly Kyle's age, perhaps a year older, with dark hair cut unevenly close to her head, as though she had done it herself with a knife and hadn't much cared about the result. Her clothes were layered and mismatched. 2 large trousers tucked into boots that were good quality, but old, a wool wrap cinched at her waist with a piece of cord. She had the look of someone who had learned early to be competent, because no one else was going to be competent on her behalf. She looked up and saw Kyle standing at the tree line and did not startle. She just looked at him steadily, with dark brown eyes that held no particular hostility, but also no performance of welcome. Just the flat, honest assessment of a person taking an accurate measure. "You're from the palace," she said, not a question. "Yes," Kyle said. "You can come closer if you want. The fire's better than standing out there." That was it. No interrogation. No narrowed eyes measuring what he smelled like or didn't smell like. No careful performance of tolerance that was really just a slower form of rejection. She turned back to her fire, made a small adjustment to the embers, and made room, just shifted 6 inches to the left, so there was a space on the log beside her. Kyle walked to the fire and sat down. One of the older men glanced at him and offered a short nod. The woman with the needle didn't look up but said, without any particular emphasis, "There's tea if you want it." The large man with the scar continued splitting kindling and did not acknowledge him, which felt, strangely, like its own form of respect. The acknowledgement that Kale's presence required no special handling. The brindled dog circled the fire twice and lay down near the woman's feet. "I'm Ilara," the girl said, still watching her embers. "Kyle." She nodded as though this was sufficient, which it was. They sat in silence for a while, the fire between them doing what fires do, filling the silence with something purposeful. Then giving people a place to put their eyes when talking felt like too much. The cold pressed in from the tree line but didn't reach the fire's inner circle. Someone handed Kyle a tin cup of something hot and dark that was not quite tea and not quite anything else, but was warm all the way down. He sat with these people who had been forgotten by the same world that had forgotten him, and he felt, not happy, not yet, because he was still too close to the dining hall and his father's averted eyes for happiness to reach him, but something adjacent to it. Something that occupied the same shape as belonging without yet daring to call itself that. He didn't know, sitting there on that log with his hands wrapped around a tin cup, that he had just made the most important decision of his life without making a decision at all. What was built from people who had nothing to, was built from people who had nothing to offer each other except room at the fire, and had decided, without ceremony or declaration, that room at the fire was enough. It was more than he'd had inside the palace walls. It was more than enough. The palace had a second language. Every great house did. A dialect of lowered voices and significant glances, of conversations that meant one thing on the surface and something entirely different underneath. Kyle had grown up fluent in it without ever being taught. You learned it the way you learned cold, not from anyone explaining it, but from enough exposure that your body simply began to recognize the signs. Dangerous things move when they don't want to. Dangerous things move when they don't want to be identified as dangerous. Through an exchanged look between two senior warriors outside the war room, through the sudden silence that fell when a junior servant entered a conversation already in progress, through the precise and practiced sympathy on the face of Lady Voss, Celine's closest attendant, when someone made the mistake of mentioning the boy's name within her earshot. "It's a tragedy, truly," Lady Voss would say, pressing one hand briefly to her collarbone. "The poor child. No scent, no shift, no future in a pack like this. One has to wonder what mercy looks like in a situation so complicated." Mercy. That for 2 weeks now, deploying it in small for 2 weeks now, deploying it in small doses across enough conversations that it had begun to feel like a conclusion the court had reached on its own. What does mercy look like for a boy like that? The question hung in the palace air like wood smoke, invisible but pervasive, getting into everything. Celine raised it directly with Darian on a Tuesday evening, in the private sitting room off their chambers, where the fire was always lit and the chairs were arranged to suggest intimacy and candor. But she waited until he was tired. She always waited until he was tired. And then she sat across from him with her hands folded and her expression calibrated to the precise frequency of reluctant concern. "I've been thinking about Kale," she said, and let the name rest between them for a moment. "About what's fair to him, living this way, neither fully inside nor outside. It's a cruelty, Darian, to keep him tethered to a position he'll never be able to hold." Darian said nothing. He was looking at the fire. Formally redirecting the succession isn't punishment, she continued, her voice gentling on the word formally, the way you gentle a hand over something sharp, so you don't appear to be handling anything dangerous. It's clarity. It gives the boy a defined place instead of this limbo. As Celine agreed, as though this proved her point. He's 7, she said. Yes, Celine agreed, as though this proved her point. Which is exactly why now is the time, before expectations calcify, before the court grows more uncertain than it already is. She paused, then added with perfect softness, before he grows old enough to feel the rejection more acutely. She let him sit with that. She was patient. She had always been patient, because she understood that the most durable structures were the ones built slowly, stone by stone. Each piece laid before the next was added, until the thing standing at the end looked nothing like construction and everything like landscape. Darian stared at the fire. He did not say yes, but he did not say no. And in the architecture of Celine's patience, silence was a foundation. Outside, beyond the garden wall, beyond the silver birches, the fire in the stray camp was burning well. Kyle had his cards out. A worn deck Mira had pressed into his hands months ago, the edges soft with handling, the faces of the court cards rubbed to near abstraction. He held them with the practiced ease of someone who had spent many solitary hours learning their weight, and he was attempting, with mixed results, to explain the rules to Alara. So the wolves beat the moons, Alara said, studying her hand with deep suspicion. Unless there are 3 moons beats everything. That's arbitrary. That's the game. She looked up at him flatly. Who made this game? Mira. Is Mira well? She's the only person in that palace who is. Alara considered this, then looked back at her cards with renewed seriousness, as though she now understood that winning was a matter of honoring the source. She rearranged her hand, rearranged it again, held it sideways as though the angle might reveal something new. I'm going to beat you, she said. You have 2 moons and a river card. You're not going to beat me. You don't know what I have. You just told me. She looked up. He was already grinning, not a performed grin, not the careful, contained expressions he wore inside the palace walls, but the real thing, sudden and ungoverned, breaking across his face before he had a chance to decide whether it was appropriate. It changed his whole face. It made him look exactly what he was, a 7-year-old boy sitting by a fire, playing cards. Alara stared at him for a moment, and then despite herself, despite the studied practicality she wore like armor, she laughed, short and sharp, like it had escaped before she approved it. The old woman with the needle smiled without looking up. The fire crackled. Inside the palace, Celine was building her case stone by stone, and Darian was staring at the fire, and the court was whispering its careful, merciful whispers. Outside, the Alpha's son was laughing. He didn't know what was being decided about him in that warm and fire-lit room. And in this one cold and honest moment, in the company of people who wanted nothing from him except his next card, it didn't reach him. Not yet. Mira came to find him on a Sunday. A tree line, in the late afternoon, with her tree line in the late afternoon, with her coat buttoned to the throat, and something tucked under her arm, and she picked her way through the frosted grass with the careful determination of a woman who had made a decision and was not interested in reconsidering it. Alara looked up from the rope she was braiding, assessed Mira in one long glance, and quietly took herself to the other side of the camp with the instinct of someone who understood when a conversation was not meant for them. Mira sat beside Kyle on the log without preamble. She was breathing harder than usual from the walk. She set the thing she'd been carrying in her lap and kept her hands over it. And for a moment she just looked at him. Really looked. In the way she rarely allowed herself to. The way that said she was setting down some carefully maintained composure and letting herself see him plainly. He waited. He had learned patience from her, among other things. "There is something you should have been told a long time ago," she said. "That it wasn't told to you is not something I can fix, but that you don't know it, that I can." She lifted her hands from the thing in her lap. It was a portrait. Small, the kind painted on a thin panel of wood rather than canvas, the size of a book, the sort of thing made to be carried or hidden. The paint was fine-worked and careful, the colors still vivid despite age. A woman looked out from it with the contained, a self-possessed expression of someone who had agreed to sit for the portrait, but had not agreed to be anything other than exactly herself in the process. She was beautiful in an unperformed way, dark hair, strong jaw, and eyes that were the precise shade and particular quality of Kael's own. Not just the color, the way they were set, the steadiness in them. He knew before Mira said anything. "Your mother," Mira said. "Lena, the first Luna of Ironvale." Kael took the portrait carefully in both hands and looked at it for a long time without speaking. He had no memories of her. She had been gone before he drew his second breath. And so what he felt looking at her face was not grief exactly, because grief required a before. It was something quieter and more disorienting than that. As to the recognition of a shape you had been missing without knowing what shape you were missing. "She was 23, Mira said. When you were born, when she..." She stopped, started again. "She was the kind of person that a room notices when she enters it. Not because she asked it to. Just because she was vivid. That's the word. Vivid in a way that most people aren't." She paused. "She smelled like rain and cedar. I've never smelled anything like it before or since. It was so particular to her that on the day she passed, wolves who hadn't seen her in years felt it go. Felt the absence of it. The whole pack wept, Kael. Not because they were told to, because something that had been in the air was suddenly gone." Kael's thumb moved very slightly across the painted face. "You have her eyes," Mira said, and her voice dropped on the words in a way that made them land differently from everything else she had said. Not information, but something she had been holding for 7 years and was only now setting down. "Exactly her eyes. The first time I looked at you after you were born, that was the first thing I saw. I thought, well, I thought at least he has that. At least he carries something of her that no one can take." He looked up from the portrait. The question had lived in him for as long as he could remember, and he had never asked it of anyone because asking meant acknowledging that the answer mattered, and he had learned to be careful about revealing what mattered to him. But Mira was looking at him with an openness that made the careful thing feel unnecessary. "Why didn't my scent come?" he asked. "Is it because of how she died? Because of me?" The question cost him something. He could feel it leaving him. Mira was quiet for long enough that the fire popped and a log shifted, and somewhere in the birches, a bird made a sound and went still. She wasn't avoiding the question. He could see her turning it over, selecting the true thing rather than the easy thing, which was always how she operated. "I don't know the whole of it," she said finally. "I'm not a healer. I can't tell you the mechanism." She looked at him steadily. "What I can tell you is that I have lived a long time, Kael, long enough to see many wolves come into themselves, and I have noticed, not always, but often enough to count, that the ones who take the longest to bloom are not the lesser ones." She paused. "They are the ones the world isn't ready for yet." She let that settle. Some wolves bloom late," she said quietly. "The ones that do, bloom different." Kael looked down at his mother's painted face, at the rain and cedar woman who had been vivid enough that the whole pack felt her absence. He didn't say anything. He wasn't sure there were words for what was moving through him. Something that was not quite hope, because it was sturdier than hope, deeper rooted, less dependent on outcome. He sat with his mother's eyes looking up at him from the wood panel in his hands, and Mira sat beside him while the afternoon went gray around them, and nothing needed to be resolved or concluded. It was enough for now, just to know he had come from something loved. The boy's name was Brennan, and he arrived at Ironvale the way all visiting pack sons arrived, loudly, and with an audience already assembled in his own mind. He was the eldest son of Alpha Crest of the Dunmore Pack, 11 years old to Kyle's 7, broad across the shoulders in the way that some wolf children were from early, the body already beginning to organize itself around what it would become. He had his father's coloring, dark and heavy-browed, and the particular confidence of a boy who had never once been made to feel that his presence was anything other than an asset to whatever room he entered. He wore it the way some people wore expensive clothes, not ostentatiously, just as a baseline assumption about how the world was arranged. He had been at Ironvale for 2 days as part of some diplomatic exchange Kyle understood nothing about and cared less for. Accompanied by his father and a small retinue of Dunmore warriors who sat in the great hall in the evenings and made the air feel crowded. Kyle had kept to his usual geography during the visit, the back steps in the morning, the birchwood in the afternoon. But the palace was smaller than usual with guests in it, and small spaces had a way of eventually producing collisions. It happened in the outer courtyard on the 3rd morning. Kyle was cutting through it on his way to the garden wall when Brennan appeared from the side entrance with 2 Dunmore boys, his own age, flanking him like a formation already practiced. They saw Kyle at the same moment Kyle saw them, and there was a beat. The kind of beat where a situation decides what it's going to be. And then Brennan smiled. It was not a good smile. "You're the Alpha's son," Brennan said, stopping in the middle of the courtyard as though he owned the stones under his feet. "The one they feed outside." His companions made sounds that were not quite laughs, but were designed to function as them. Kyle stopped walking. He said nothing. "I heard about you from my father," Brennan continued, moving forward in the unhurried way of someone who has assessed a situation and found no risk in it. He said it was the strangest thing he'd ever heard. An Alpha's heir with no wolf scent. He tilted his head, the gesture approximating curiosity while actually performing something else. "Can you even shift?" The courtyard had acquired witnesses the way courtyards do. A servant crossing with linens pausing, 2 palace guards finding reasons to be still, a cluster of Dunmore attendants who had followed their young charge at a distance. Shift," Brennan said. Not a question this time. A command issued by a boy who had learned that authority was mainly about tone. "Let's see it. Or can't you?" Kyle looked at him steadily. The honest answer was no. He couldn't shift. Had never shifted. Had felt nothing of the internal reorganization that other wolf children described as happening between their 8th and 10th year. A deep biological unlocking that arrived like a second voice joining a conversation. Nothing had unlocked in him yet. He was 7 years old and scentless and unshifted and standing in the middle of a courtyard with witnesses on all sides. He didn't move. Not backward, not forward. He simply stood in the same spot on the same stones and looked at Brennan with Lena's eyes, steady and unperformed, and said nothing. Just because he had understood something essential in the last 3 seconds, that Brennan didn't actually want him to shift. Brennan wanted him to try and fail. And the second thing he understood, equally essential, was that refusing to perform was not the same as admitting defeat, no matter how loudly someone implied otherwise. Brennan's smile tightened. "Nothing? Just going to stand there?" "Yes," Kale said. It was the first word he had spoken, and it came out level and unembellished. And something about its plainness seemed to irritate Brennan more than argument would have. He took another step forward, closing the distance to something that was meant to feel like pressure, and he was drawing breath for whatever came next when a sound came from the courtyard entrance. Footsteps. Unhurried. Certain. Alara walked in like she had been invited. Then she crossed the courtyard stones without pausing and came to stand beside Kyle, not in front of him, not in a posture of shielding, but beside him, shoulder to level with his, which, given the height difference between them, meant she had to angle herself slightly, but did so without apparent awareness of the fact. She looked at Brennan with the same flat, taking accurate measure expression she had turned on Kale the first morning at the fire. She said nothing, either. Behind her, after a moment, came the quiet sound of more footsteps. The large man with the scar, Cavan, Kyle had learned his name by now, appeared in the courtyard entrance. Then the two older men from the fire. Then the silver-haired woman. They did not rush. They did not form any aggressive configuration. They simply arrived, one by one, and stood loosely behind Alara, the way people stand when they have somewhere to be and have decided this is it. Strays. Omegas. Rogues. Every one of them. Someone the world had discarded. Standing behind the Alpha's scentless sun, like he was worth standing behind. Brennan looked at them, looked at the assembled faces, weathered, unhurried, utterly unbothered by his father's alliance or his broad shoulders or his practiced authority, and something shifted in his expression. Not fear exactly. Something more uncomfortable than fear, because fear at least made sense. This was the specific discomfort of a person whose script has stopped working and who cannot locate the appropriate replacement. He looked back at Kyle. Kyle had not moved, had not changed expression, but he was still standing in the same spot on the same stones and looking at Brennan with those steady, unreadable eyes. And the silence between them had a quality to it now. Not the silence of someone waiting to see what happens, but the silence of someone who has already decided it. Brennan held the moment for 3 seconds longer than was comfortable, which was the only victory available to him now. And then he turned and walked back toward the palace entrance with his companions close behind him, the formation somewhat less assured on the return than it had been on the approach. The courtyard exhaled. Alara glanced sideways at Kyle. He glanced back. Something passed between them that was not quite words and not quite a smile. More an acknowledgement, two people confirming a shared understanding without making it large. Caven turned and walked back toward the birchwood. The others followed, unhurried as they'd arrived. Kyle stood alone in the courtyard for another moment, looking at the empty space where Brennan had been. He had not shifted. He had not spoken more than one word. He had not won anything by any measure the palace would recognize, but he was still standing exactly where he had been standing when it started. And somehow, for reasons he couldn't yet articulate but felt in the same place he felt the fire's warmth and Mira's hand on the back of his neck, that felt like the truest kind of victory, the kind that didn't need a crowd to confirm it. He turned and followed the strays back through the garden wall. It was the firewood that broke him first. Darian had not planned to look. He was passing through the east corridor on his way to the war room, a route he had walked 1,000 times without pausing, when something at the edge of his vision pulled his attention to the window. He stopped without deciding to, put one hand on the stone sill, and looked down into the yard below where it sloped toward the garden wall and the birch wood beyond. Kale was carrying firewood, not a small amount, a full bundle, split logs stacked and bound with cord, held across both arms in the way you hold something that is almost too heavy, but that you have decided is not going to be too heavy through sheer force of will. He was moving steadily, picking his path through the frost-stiff grass with the focused economy of someone who has a job and intends to complete it. At the edge of the tree line, on Old Fenwick, one of the Omega men Darian vaguely recognized as having been pushed out of a neighboring pack 3 winters back, was stacking what Kyle brought him and nodding in a way that was not performative gratitude, but something quieter and more durable. The nod of one person acknowledging another person's usefulness. Darian stood at the window and watched his son make 3 trips. He told himself he was simply observing, that it meant nothing, that a father watching his child from a window was not, in itself, an indictment of anything. He stayed at the window. The girl, Ilara, he had heard her name from a guard who had mentioned the courtyard incident in passing, appeared from the trees with her expression wrong. Even from the height of the east corridor, Darian could read it. The particular flatness that falls over a young face when it has received news that is too large for it and has not yet found the shape of the grief inside it. She sat down on a fallen log at the camp's edge and stared at nothing. Kyle set down his last bundle of wood. He crossed to where Alara sat, and he sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. He didn't speak, as far as Darian could tell. Didn't put an arm around her or make large gestures of comfort. He just sat there, present and unhurried, with the particular quality of stillness that Darian recognized as something his son had learned the hard way. That sometimes the most honest thing you can offer someone is simply the fact of your continued presence. After a while, Elara leaned sideways until her head rested against Kyle's shoulder. He didn't move. Darian's hand tightened on the stone sill. He had told himself, in the months of deliberate inattention, that Kyle was fine, that children were resilient, that the arrangement, if you called it that, if you let the word arrangement do the work of describing what had actually happened, was temporary, transitional, a situation that would resolve itself when the boy's scent came in, when things settled, when Celine's anxieties about succession were addressed, and the pack's uncertainty quieted. He had told himself these things with the same conviction he brought to military decisions and territorial disputes, and he had been, if he was being precise, lying. What he saw from the window was not a child surviving a temporary arrangement. It was a child who had built a life in the place where his father had failed to provide one. He went to Celine that night. She was at her writing desk when he entered. Correspondence, always correspondence. The web of alliances and obligations she maintained with the meticulous attention of someone who understood that power was infrastructure before it was anything else. She looked up with the expression she wore when she was prepared to be reasonable, which was itself a form of warning. "I want Kyle brought inside," Darian said. He had decided, on the walk from the east corridor to their chambers, to say it plainly without preamble, because preamble gave her architecture to work with. Celine set down her pen. "I see," she said, and then, after a considered pause, "Tell me what you're hoping that achieves." "He's my son." "He is," she agreed, with a gentleness calibrated to devastating effect. "And what does bringing him inside look like, Darian? In practical terms. He sits at the table, the same table where the pack elders, the warriors, the visiting allies assess the future of Iron Vale's leadership every time they dine. He sits there scentless, unshifted, at 8 years old. And what does the pack see? What does it do to their confidence?" She folded her hands. "What does it do to him when the whispers grow louder instead of quieter?" "He's already outside in the cold." "He's outside with people who have accepted him," she said, and the softness in her voice was a precision instrument. "You would bring him inside to a court that hasn't." Darian opened his mouth. "My son's future," Celine continued, and here her voice changed, just fractionally, just enough, "is bound to Iron Vale. My family's alliance is bound to Iron Vale. If the succession becomes contested, unclear, my father will not maintain a partnership with a pack that cannot answer the basic question of who leads next." She let that land. "I am not threatening you. I am telling you the shape of things." The shape of things. Darian stood in the warm, firelit room with its correspondence and its careful arrangements and its permanently maintained composure, and he felt something in his chest that he could not name and could not afford. He went back to the east corridor. The camp was dark now, the fire banked low. He could just make out the shapes of people sleeping under canvas and wool. And there, at the edge of the light, and on the ground near Alara's shelter, was a smaller shape under a blanket he recognized. Wool, dark gray, with a frayed edge on one side. Mira's blanket, from the kitchen stores, his son, asleep on the ground, covered by a blanket smuggled out by the palace cook, because no one else had thought to provide one. Darian stood at the window for a long time. He did not go downstairs. The blood moon came on a Thursday, which felt wrong to Kyle. Sacred things, he had always imagined, should arrive on days that felt set apart. Thursdays were ordinary. Thursdays smelled like wood smoke and Mira's black tea and the particular mud that collected near the camp's eastern edge when the ground thawed. But the moon didn't consult anyone's sense of occasion. And by the time the sun went down and the sky deepened to its full dark, the moon that rose over Ironvale was the color of an old wound, deep red at its edges, burnished at its center, enormous in the way blood moons always were, as though the sky had moved it closer to make a point. Inside the palace, Celine had been preparing for a week. The ceremony for her son, Aldrich, 12 years old, already shifted twice, the scent of him already strong enough that senior warriors acknowledged him in corridors, was the kind of event she constructed the way she constructed everything, with complete control over every variable. The great hall had been dressed in Ironvale's formal colors. Candles burned in the iron chandeliers. The pack elders were seated. The visiting dignitaries were seated. Darian sat at the head of the table in his ceremonial collar and looked, from a distance, like exactly what he was supposed to be. Aldrich stood at the center of it all and received the pack's formal acknowledgement with the easy confidence of a boy who had been prepared for this moment since he could walk. Kyle was not inside. He had not been told about the ceremony. There had been no messenger, no invitation, no carefully worded exclusion, just the ordinary silence of his ordinary invisibility, which by now had become so total that it no longer required active maintenance. He simply did not factor into the palace's calculations, and so the great hall blazed with light and ceremony, and the Alpha's heir stood at its center, and outside in the birch wood the fire burned low, and the strays gathered in their own quiet way, as they always did when the moon was significant. It was Fenwick who had explained the blood moon to Cale the first time he'd heard the term. Sitting by the fire 2 weeks ago, the old Omega tracing the lunar cycle in the dirt with a stick, explaining in his patient, unhurried way that blood moons were thresholds in the old tradition. Moments when the membrane between what a wolf was and what it was becoming grew thin. Not every wolf felt it, but some, the ones standing at the edge of something, felt it as a kind of pressure, a hand pressing from the inside. Tonight the strays had arranged themselves in a loose circle around the fire, closer together than usual, the way animals arrange themselves when the weather is about to change and the body knows before the mind does. No one had organized it. It had simply happened. Alara sat to Kyle's left, close enough that their arms touched. Cavan was across the fire, his scarred face lit unevenly by the flames, his eyes moving between the fire and the moon, with the expression of a man paying attention to something he can hear, but not yet locate. Fenwick had brought out a small clay vessel of salt and ash. The old pack ritual, the one that predated the palaces and the politics and the formal ceremonies, the one practiced before wolves had great halls to practice in. He passed it around the circle without explanation, and each person touched 2 fingers to it, and that was sufficient. Ritual, in its oldest form, required nothing elaborate, just intention, just presence. Cale touched his fingers to the salt and ash and felt nothing at first. Then, 20 minutes into the silence, something shifted. It began in his spine. Not pain, not exactly, but pressure, the way Fenwick had described it, a pushing from the inside outward, as though something that had been compressed for 8 years was making a decision about compression. He shifted on the ground, trying to find a position that accommodated it. Alara glanced at him. He shook his head slightly. "I'm fine." And she accepted this and looked back at the fire. The pressure built. It moved from his spine to his chest and then outward through his arms and into his hands, and his hands were trembling now in a way that had nothing to do with cold, and he pressed them flat against the ground to still them, but the ground didn't help, and then the pressure reached his jaw, and his vision went white at the edges, and he understood, with the clarity that arrives just before the body overrides the mind completely, and that this was not something he could manage. He convulsed. Not a small thing. His whole body seized sideways, and Alara caught him before he hit the ground, her arms around him, her voice sharp and frightened, calling his name in a way he had never heard from her, because Alara did not frighten easily, and the fact of her fear reached him even through the white noise filling his skull. He heard the strays moving, feet on the frozen ground, someone's voice low and urgent, Kavan saying something that sounded like, "Don't hold him down, don't hold him." And then the white noise peaked and broke, like a wave finding the shore and finally, fully, releasing everything it had carried across the open water. The scent came. It did not arrive the way a wolf's scent normally arrived, gradually, incrementally, the way a pup's voice deepens. It's something you notice in retrospect rather than in the moment. It came all at once, like a door blown open by wind that had been building for 8 years on the other side. It poured off him in the way that heat pours off something that has been burning underground, vast and pressured, and carrying with it the sense of something that had been contained far beyond its natural duration. And it was not a normal scent. Alara felt it first, physically. Her arms, still around Kyle, went rigid. Not with fear, with something more involuntary than fear. Her chin dropped toward her chest before she understood why. Across the fire, Fenwick went still in a way that was different from his ordinary stillness. His eyes widened fractionally, and then his head moved, down, slow, the way a heavy thing descends when its counterweight is removed. He did not appear to decide to do it. Cavan's knife, which he had been holding, landed in the dirt. His hand had opened without instruction. He was on one knee before he registered the transition from standing. The two older men at the fire's edge simply sat down where they were, as though their legs had received a memo their minds hadn't read yet. The scent was ancient in the way that certain things are ancient. Not old exactly, but prior. Pre-palace, pre-politics, pre the entire architecture of rank and alliance and carefully maintained hierarchy that the Iron Veil Pack had spent 4 generations constructing. It smelled like the thing that had existed before all of that. The source code underneath the structure. It smelled like alpha, the way lightning smelled like electricity. Not a symbol of the thing, but the thing itself. Raw and undelegated. Alara was still holding him. Her head was bowed. Her arms had not loosened. She was still holding him. Still there. And the fact that she stayed even as everything in her wolf instinct was pressing her down was the most Alara thing she had ever done, and Kyle would remember it longer than almost anything else that happened that night. He lay in the circle of her arms and looked up at the blood moon and breathed. The fire crackled. The strays knelt in the dark around him, not because they had decided to, but because something older than decision had reached up through the frozen ground and bent their knees for them. The boy who smelled of nothing had become something the oldest wolves in the old stories had only spoken of in past tense. And the palace, blazing with its ceremony 50 yards away, had no idea. And the scent reached the palace walls before dawn. It moved the way water moves through stone, not dramatically, not all at once, but finding every hairline crack and pressing through with the patient certainty of something that understood it had time. By the 4th hour after midnight, it had crossed the garden. By the 5th, it had reached the outer walls. By the time the sky began its gray, reluctant shift toward morning, it was inside. The first person to feel it was a guard on the night rotation, a senior warrior named Aldous, who had held his post for 11 years without incident, a man whose defining characteristic was an absolute solidity of disposition that his commanding officer had once described as the human equivalent of a load-bearing wall. Aldous felt the scent arrive the way you feel a change in air pressure, before you can name it, before you can locate its source. just the sudden bodily knowledge that something has shifted in the fundamental conditions of the world around you. His spear hit the stone floor. He didn't feel his hands open. He was on one knee before the conscious part of him had finished asking what was happening, and he stayed there in the torchlit corridor with his head bowed and his heart doing something it had never done in 11 years of guarding, which was to recognize with absolute and wordless certainty that it was in the presence of something above its pay grade. He was not the only one. In the barracks, as three warriors woke simultaneously from dead sleep and sat upright in their cots, with the coordinated bewilderment of men who have heard a sound and cannot locate it, except it wasn't a sound. Two of them were on their feet and moving toward the door before they understood they were moving. The third made it to his knees on the barracks floor and stayed there, head lowered, trying to remember how rank worked and finding that the usual architecture of it had temporarily stopped making sense. In the kitchens, two servants paused mid-task and looked at each other across a work table with identical expressions of confusion and something that was not quite awe but occupied the same territory. In the great hall, where the blood moon ceremony's aftermath was still being cleared, linens folded, candles snuffed, and the evidence of Aldrich's celebration dismantled by quiet hands, a young servant girl stopped walking and stood very still in the center of the floor with a stack of plates in her arms, and her eyes full of something she couldn't name, and would spend the rest of her life trying to describe accurately. Celine woke at the first gray light. She was not a heavy sleeper. She had never permitted herself to be, operating on the understanding that the world conducted its most significant business in the hours when most people were unconscious. She woke cleanly, as she always did, and lay still for 3 seconds in the practiced way of someone taking inventory before moving. Then the scent reached her. She had been a wolf her entire life. She had grown up in a pack of considerable strength, had married into one of greater strength still, and had spent 12 years building her understanding of power into something precise and comprehensive. She knew what a strong alpha smelled like. She knew what a dominant wolf smelled like. She knew what ambition and bloodline and authority smelled like when they accumulated in a single person. She had never smelled anything like this. She went white. Not the white of fear, exactly, though fear was in it, but the white of a person looking at a calculation they had been running for years and understanding, in a single devastating moment, that they had been working with the wrong numbers the entire time. The plan she had built, stone by stone, Celine's careful, patient architecture, had been built around a boy with no scent, a scentless child with no wolf, no shift, no claim that the pack's instincts would recognize. She had been so certain of what he was. Beside her, Darian was already awake. Had been for some time, she realized. He was sitting up with his feet on the floor and his hands loose in his lap, and his face wearing an expression she had not seen on it in 12 years of marriage. Not confusion. Not the bovine patience he sometimes wore when she was managing him. Something older than either of those things. Something that looked, if she was being precise, like a man hearing a voice he had been trying not to hear for a very long time, and finding that his capacity to not hear it had finally, completely, run out. He stood. He didn't look at her. And he walked to the door in his sleeping clothes and into the corridor, and she heard his footsteps moving not toward the war room or the great hall, but toward the east staircase that led down and out, and she knew, with the cold clarity of someone watching a structure fail, exactly where he was going. She did not follow immediately. She sat in the gray morning light and breathed and rebuilt herself, which took longer than it ever had before. Darian walked through the palace in a state that was not quite waking and not quite dreaming. The pull of the scent was not like anything the rational part of him could process cleanly. It bypassed the part of him that made decisions and spoke directly to the part that preceded decisions, the part that was wolf before it was alpha. Before it was husband or politician or man who chose silence at a dinner table while his son carried his plate outside. That part had no interest in his reasons. It simply moved his feet. Guards stepped aside as he passed. Not in the formal, practiced way they stepped aside for an alpha's passage. In the involuntary way of people whose bodies have received information their minds are still catching up to. Two of them were already on one knee in the corridor, and didn't appear to know how they'd gotten there. He came through the east door and into the yard. The morning was cold and colorless, the frost still heavy on the grass, the birch trees at the tree line standing pale and still in the early light. The strays were arranged at the yard's edge, not in any formation anyone had designed, but the way things arranged themselves around a center of gravity. Cavan to the left, broad and scarred and utterly still. Fenwick beside him, head slightly bowed. The silver-haired woman. The others. All of them oriented around the same point. Alara stood at the front of them, one step ahead, her chin up, and Kyle stood at the center. He was in the same clothes he'd worn yesterday. His hair was unkempt from sleep. He was 8 years old and slight, and standing on the frost-killed grass of his father's yard with the strays arrayed behind him, and the scent coming off him in the cold morning air was the most authoritative thing Darian had encountered in 34 years of living inside a hierarchy built around authority. Darian stopped walking. They looked at each other across the yard, father and son, and Alpha and whatever Kale was becoming, and Kale did not move, did not run forward, did not reach for him with the desperate, forgiving instinct of a child who has been waiting. There was no performance of relief, no collapse of the composure he had built, piece by careful piece, in the cold and the dark, and the company of people who had chosen him without being obligated to. He just looked. With Lena's eyes, steady and unperformed and carrying, in their depths, a full accounting of everything that had happened and everything that had not. Every dinner plate carried outside, every blanket smuggled through a kitchen door, every window his father had stood at and then walked away from. Darian felt his knees begin to go. Not metaphorically. The actual, physical architecture of his body began to make the same negotiation that every wolf in the yard had already made. The negotiation between what you thought you were and what the oldest part of you recognized it was standing in front of. His knees bent. The frost-hard ground came up to meet them, and he let it, because there was nothing left in him that was capable of the alternative. The alpha of the Iron Veil pack knelt in the frost before his 8-year-old son. Behind him, from the palace doorway, he heard the sound of more footsteps. Warriors, servants, drawn out by the same pull, blinking in the gray morning light, arriving one by one to witness something that none of the palace's ceremonies, none of its formal acknowledgments and carefully staged rituals had ever produced. A truth that didn't need a stage. Kale looked at his father on his knees in the frost, and his expression did not change, but something moved through his eyes, deep and complicated, the way weather moves through a sky that has decided to clear. Not forgiveness, not yet. That was a longer road and they both knew it. But something that meant the road existed. Darian's knees were on the frozen ground, and the cold came through them immediately, the kind of cold that makes the body pay attention, that removes all ambiguity about what is happening and what position you are in. He had knelt before no one in 34 years, not in ceremony, not in politics, not in the private negotiations of his marriage where Celine had extracted concession after concession through the careful application of patience and precision. He had remained upright through all of it. The frost didn't care about his record. He reached up and extended his hand toward Kale, open-palmed, upward-facing, the oldest gesture of submission in their tradition, the one that predated language. Not the hand of an alpha offering acknowledgement to a subordinate, the hand of a man asking to be taken back by someone who had every right to refuse him. Kale looked at it for a moment, then he took it. His small hand closed around his father's larger one, and the contact landed in Darian's chest like something structural giving way. Not breaking, but settling, the way a building settles when the ground beneath it finally stops moving. He had not held his son's hand since Kale was an infant. He had not let himself. Proximity was its own kind of accountability, and he had been, for years, a man allergic to what he owed. But the hand in his was not warm. It was present. It was there. It had chosen to be there. But it did not grip back with the instinctive, unguarded pressure of a child who has forgotten why it was withheld. It rested in his with the careful, conscious quality of something extended as a decision rather than a reflex. Kyle was 8 years old, and he had already learned the difference between those two things, which was perhaps the saddest evidence of everything Darian had failed to prevent. He held his son's hand and felt the full weight of what being held carefully, rather than freely, actually meant. Around them, the yard continued to fill. They came in ones and twos, and then in clusters, warriors from the barracks still pulling on jackets, servants from the kitchen corridor with their hands still flour-dusted, pack members who had felt the scent reach them in sleep and had followed it out into the morning with the helpless, homing quality of people answering something they hadn't known was a question. They arranged themselves in the yard with the unconscious order of iron filings near a magnet, oriented toward Kyle without deciding to be. And the ones whose wolf instincts ran deepest were already lowering their heads before they fully understood why. Then the palace door opened again, and the yard went a different kind of quiet. Celine came through it with Aldrich behind her, and her composure intact, which was itself a remarkable thing, given what she had smelled from the bedroom, and what it had told her about the last 8 years of careful construction. She was dressed, her hair was arranged. Whatever the morning had done to her internally, she had taken the time to ensure that externally she arrived as herself, controlled, composed, the Luna of Iron Vale, a woman who did not lose. She surveyed the yard, the kneeling Alpha, the boy standing over him, the pack assembled in the frost like a congregation. Her eyes moved across it all with the rapid, comprehensive assessment of a tactician reading a battlefield, looking for the leverage point, the angle, the thing that could still be redirected. "This is a significant moment," she said, and her voice was steady and carried well in the cold air. "One that deserves proper ceremony, proper context. These things should be handled inside, with the elders present, through the appropriate channels of pack law." "The appropriate channels," said a voice from the back of the crowd, "had 8 years. It was Kavan." He said it without heat, as without performance, in the same flat, unembellished tone he used for everything, the tone of a man who had been pushed beyond the point where he felt obligated to soften his observations for anyone's comfort. A few of the warriors near him shifted, not away from him, toward him. Celine's eyes moved to Kavan, then to the strays arrayed behind Kyle, Fenwick, the silver-haired woman, the others, and something moved across her face that she controlled in under a second, but that everyone close enough to see it would remember. It was the look of a woman watching her architecture fail. She drew breath to speak again, and then the crowd moved. Not dramatically, not a parting of waters, but a ripple, a series of adjustments, people shifting sideways and forward and creating a channel without being asked to. The way crowds move when someone is coming through who needs to come through. Mira emerged from the channel with her coat thrown over her kitchen clothes and her white hair coming loose from its pins and her face doing nothing to contain what was on it. She was crying in the open, uncomplicated way of someone who has been holding something for 8 years and has just been relieved of it without warning. Not quiet tears, real ones, the kind that don't ask permission, that arrive with the full force of everything they represent. She crossed the yard with more speed than her knees usually permitted, and she came to Kyle, and she took his face in both her wide, warm hands, and she looked at him. "Little Alpha," she said. She had said it 100 times. In the dark, in the cold, on the back steps before the palace woke, It's in the servants' passage where no one of importance walked. She had said it as a private truth in a world that was committed to a different version of events. She said it now, in a yard full of witnesses, at full volume, with her hands on his face, and her tears making no apology for themselves. And this time, every person in that yard heard it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of a crowd that has just had something confirmed that it had needed confirmed, a truth that had been waiting in the cold for someone to say it out loud in the light. Kael's composure, which had held through the blood moon and through his father's kneeling and through Celine's attempt to reclaim the narrative, moved for the first time. Not breaking, but shifting, the way the sky shifts in the first real moment of dawn. Or when the gray becomes something else. He put one hand briefly over Mira's and pressed it, and she understood everything in that pressure and closed her eyes. He looked at the strays then. All of them. Cavan with his scar and his opened knife hand. Fenwick with his clay vessel and his old pack rituals. The silver-haired woman who had offered tea without asking his name first. Elara, standing where she had stood since the beginning. Beside him, one step forward, chin up. He looked at them the way you look at the people who fed you when you were hungry and sat with you in the dark and asked nothing in return except your company, which they had somehow considered sufficient. Then he turned to face the pack. And all of it, the warriors and the servants and the elders who had arrived from the palace interior, and the people who had whispered about him in corridors for 8 years, and the people who had quietly pitied him, and the people who had followed Celine's lead without examining why. All of them standing in the frost in the gray morning light, oriented toward him, with the helpless, homing attention of wolves who have found their north. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Everyone who was left outside, Kyle said, comes in now. 7 words. Quiet. Final. Not a battle cry. Not a decree delivered with the performed authority of someone who has been practicing power. Just a statement of what was going to be true from this moment forward, delivered in the tone of someone for whom it was already settled. The yard was very still. And then Kavan walked forward past Kyle toward the palace door. Fenwick followed, the silver-haired woman. The others, one by one, crossing the frost-killed grass toward the warmth they had never been offered, walking through the door of a palace that had spent years deciding they didn't qualify for its threshold. Elara passed Kyle last. She paused beside him for a moment, and he glanced at her, and she looked back with those dark, accurate eyes, and what passed between them was too old and too particular to be called anything as simple as friendship. It was the look of 2 people who had survived the same weather and come out knowing each other's specific gravity. She went inside. Kyle stood alone in the yard for one more moment. The cold, the frost, and the back steps visible at the palace's eastern face where he had eaten his meals in the dark and learned to make himself small and watched the sky decide what kind of day it wanted to be. He looked at all of it. Then he turned and walked through the door of his father's house, and this time, no one moved his place. The palace looked different from the inside when you had earned your way back into it. Not physically. The stones were the same stones, the corridors the same corridors, the iron chandeliers throwing the same uneven light they always had. But there is a particular way a place looks when you no longer have to apologize for being in it. And Kyle felt that difference in the soles of his feet as he walked the inner halls for the first time without the sideways, minimizing gait of someone practicing invisibility. Yet he walked through the center of the corridor. He did not take the servants' passage. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. The strays were housed in the east wing, rooms that had been guest quarters, aired out and furnished by servants who moved with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that the morning's events had rearranged the order of things and that their role was to accommodate the new order, not interrogate it. Cavan had looked at the bed in his room for a long moment before sitting on its edge with his hands on his knees, saying nothing, which said everything. Fenwick had run his palm along the windowsill of his room and looked out at the birchwood below with the expression of a man taking inventory of a distance he had just crossed. The silver-haired woman, her name was Diel, as Kyle had finally learned it that morning, had simply stood in the center of her room and breathed slowly, like someone reacquainting themselves with the concept of enough. Elara had been given the room next to Kyle's. She had walked in, looked around at the furniture and the window and the actual mattress, and said, with characteristic economy, "This is excessive." Then she had sat on the bed and pulled her knees up and looked out the window at the sky, and Kyle had stood in the doorway and watched her process it, and said nothing because she deserved the silence to do it in. The harder things happened in the days that followed, because real life does not resolve in a single morning, regardless of how significant that morning is. Celine left on the third day. She did not make a scene. That had never been her method. She packed with the same meticulous composure she brought to everything, and she arranged for her son to accompany her to her family's territory, for what she described, in the brief formal communication she left for Darian, as an indefinite visit. She walked through the palace entrance in the mid-morning without looking back, and the carriage took her down the territory road, and she was gone. And the air in the palace was different immediately, not lighter exactly, but more honest. Like a room after a window is opened that has been sealed for too long. Aldrich went with her. Kyle watched the carriage from the east corridor window, the same window his father had stood at in the dark, watching him sleep on the ground, and felt something for Aldrich that surprised him with its texture. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but hoped distantly that Aldrich found something better than the role he'd been cast in. He knew what it was to be defined by someone else's agenda. It was not a thing he would wish across the yard to an enemy, let alone across the territory to a boy who had simply been born to the wrong mother's plans. Darian came to him on the fourth evening. He knocked on the door of Kyle's room, his own palace, his own door, and he knocked, and waited until Kyle said to come in. He entered and stood near the door with the particular discomfort of a large, authoritative man, who has run out of authority to hide behind, and must simply be a person now, which is frequently harder. He sat in the chair by the window when Kale gestured to it. For a while neither of them spoke, and the fire in the small hearth did what fires do, filled the silence with something purposeful. "I don't know how to do this," Darian said finally, not as an excuse, as a fact, offered plainly. "I know," Kyle said. "I failed you." He said it without preamble or qualification, which was the only way it was worth saying. Not once. Continuously. For years. And I knew it while I was doing it, which is the part I can't, which is the part I have to live with. Kyle was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the fire. "Mira told me I had my mother's eyes," he said. "Did she?" The question landed sideways, the way Kale's questions sometimes did, arriving at the important thing through an unexpected door. Darian's face moved through several things in rapid succession. "Yes," he said. His voice had changed register. "Exactly her eyes." "Tell me about her." So Darian told him, haltingly at first, then with more steadiness, about Lena, about rain and cedar, and a woman so vivid that rooms noticed her without being asked to, about the way she laughed, about the 17 minutes that had contained everything and taken everything in equal measure, about a man who had loved her and then, in his grief and his weakness, had failed to honor what she left behind. He talked for a long time. Kyle listened. He asked questions when he had them. He did not forgive his father that night, fully and completely, in the clean narrative way that stories sometimes allow, because forgiveness of that depth is not an event but a process. And he was 8 years old, and some things take as long as they take. But he listened, and when Darian finally stood to leave, Kale said quietly, without looking up from the fire, "Same time tomorrow?" Darian stopped at the door. "Yes," he said. "Same time tomorrow." The formal ceremony came 2 weeks later. Not a rushed, reactionary thing, but a proper assembly of the pack's elders, conducted in the great hall with the iron chandeliers burning and the good linen on the tables and the pack arranged in full. Kyle stood at the hall's center and received what had always been his, and the elders spoke the old words, and the pack answered them. The strays were seated at the table, all of them. Cavan and Fennec and Dale and the others, in actual chairs, with actual plates in front of them, inside the warmth of a hall that had previously looked through them as though they were weather rather than people. They sat with the particular dignity of those who have waited long enough for a thing that they have ceased to need it to be dramatic. They simply received it, and let it be enough. Elara sat to Kael's left. She had combed her hair for the occasion, which she had announced beforehand she was doing under protest. The comb had not entirely won. Kael had not mentioned this. Some things you preserve by leaving alone. Mira stood near the kitchen entrance, as she always had. But tonight someone had put a chair there for her, and she sat in it. And when Kael was formally named heir of Ironvale, and the hall responded with the old acknowledgement that rolled through the assembled pack, like thunder through a valley, though she pressed both hands to her mouth, and her shoulders shook, and she did not try to stop any of it. Little Alpha, she had called him. In the dark, in the cold, when no one was listening, and the word meant nothing to anyone except the two of them. Now the whole pack knew his name. Later that night, after the hall had emptied and the candles were burning low, Kael slipped out through the east door and walked to the back steps. He sat on the cold stone, not because he had to, not because anyone had put him there, but because he wanted to. Because that step had been, for a long time, the truest place in his world, and he wasn't ready yet to stop honoring what it had taught him. He sat with his knees to his chest and watched the dark tree line and breathed in the cold air and felt, moving through him slowly and without fanfare, the thing he had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting for it. Not triumph, not vindication. Peace. The brindled dog appeared at the bottom of the steps and looked up at him. Kael slid over. It came up and sat beside him, warm against his leg, and they looked at the tree line together the way they had on the night of the dining hall decree, except that night Kyle had been carrying something crushing and had not known how long he would have to carry it, and tonight he was simply sitting on a cold step by choice with a dog beside him, and the palace warm at his back, and his people, all of them, the ones inside and the ones who had been outside, finally under the same roof. The sky above the birch trees was clear and deep. He looked up at it for a long time, then he went inside. And that is where we leave him, not on a throne, not mid-battle, not at the edge of some new conflict. We leave him on the back steps, in the quiet, with a dog beside him, and the cold at his face, and the warmth behind him. We leave him at peace. Because after everything that boy carried, he earned the ending that asked nothing more of him. He earned the quiet. Before you go, I need you to sit with this story for just a moment. Because Kael was never the problem. He was never unworthy. He never needed to be fixed or proven or validated by the people who withheld their warmth from him. He was always exactly who he was. He just needed enough time, and enough people willing to sit with him in the cold, for the world to catch up. And I think some of you watching this know exactly what that feels like. To be the one who eats outside. To be the one who is quietly set aside while everyone else gathers in the warmth. To be told, not always in words, sometimes just in silence, that you don't qualify, that your presence is inconvenient, that the table isn't set for you. This story was written for you. Not as a promise that the world will always correct itself, but as a reminder that the people who were fed outside, the ones who built their lives in the cold, who found their people among the forgotten, who held their dignity without anyone holding it for them. Those people carry something inside them that palaces cannot manufacture. You carry something that palaces cannot manufacture. If this story moved you, if any part of Kael's journey sat in your chest the way I hoped it would, please subscribe, hit the bell, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And someone who is sitting on their own back steps right now, in their own cold, wondering if anyone will ever make room. Tell them, the ones who bloom late, bloom different. I'll see you in the next story. And as always, thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know.